Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
So, Emily, I think we're in the middle of a big inflation problem.
What? I haven't heard of this.
Yeah. Welcome to Trudeau's Canada. I do want to talk a bit about inflation, but not that kind of inflation. Not the kind of inflation that we're always talking about, thinking about. I want to talk about THC inflation, particularly with regard to Organigram's recent statements. Did you read about this?
I did. And let's face it, THC is its own currency.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It sure is. But this THC inflation problem, I just felt so funny, like inflation everywhere. And of course, we've got to be talking about, not just dollar inflation, but THC inflation. But essentially what happened, Organigram had a tough Friday from a stock perspective, dropping almost 20% after weaker than expected earnings. And, they had to get in front of it and, why are earnings down? What's going on? And Organigram CEO Beena Goldenberg addressed the issue of THC inflation as like one of the biggest things that they leaned on as far as, the miss on the earnings. And had some interesting statements around potency in cannabis and some numbers, some data here related to what they've seen happening in the market. So Goldenberg revealed that 50% of cannabis flower sales in Q3 were labeled as containing 26% or more THC. And I haven't done like a comprehensive review, but just 26% sounds pretty high to me, just from a sense of like what's in the market out there. I don't know if that's like the new baseline or what, but it seems like if I saw 26% out there, I would think that's pretty high.
Yeah, that's some boozy weed, not brunch weed, that's for sure. But I think, for a long time, it was like, if it's not above 23%, the buyers weren't going to put it on the shelves, especially here in California. So I think 26 is pretty potent, but I've seen some high THC weed here in California.
Yeah. And so, they're estimating 50% of flower sales were labeled as 26% or more. And they also highlighted the number of SKUs with THC levels above 30% increased tenfold compared to last year. And that seems like stratospheric. And so, that's interesting. And then they said that they've been particularly affected by inflation, THC inflation again, in the bulk 28 gram cannabis flower category. So, that's a full ounce of cannabis. That's a lot of cannabis. And so, I think intuitively, when you think about, THC and price per THC, like, of course, like the bulk 28 gram would most likely be the most impacted, because the people that are buying that volume are probably pretty regular consumers and probably have high tolerances, right? And they're probably looking for stuff that is higher in potency. So I'm not surprised that they call out the bulk 28 gram here.
Yeah. There are two ways to think about it too. Like medical patients, true medical patients who are using it for chronic pain or PTSD or, everybody's a true medical patient if they take it to feel better, by the way. But I'm talking about like very intense pain and body pain and mental anguish where you're consuming cannabis to alleviate those symptoms. Like I do know when our stores are working with folks like that, they need a higher potency product. And so there's the very medical side to this, but then there's also, to your point, the folks who develop, a tolerance to it. And also there's the economic calculus around this in terms of the best bang for your buck.
That's right. And in the statement regarding the 28 gram flower category, they mentioned that some producers are claiming to sell flower with THC levels 28% to 32%, which they say is unrealistic, even with advanced cultivation techniques, to get those kinds of numbers consistently. And I'm no grower. I don't know innovation in cultivation and what's possible, but this is what they're saying. They're basically alluding to that this can't be right. These kind of numbers that are getting posted can't be right, without saying calling out specific groups or calling out specific labs. And that's not something that, is new, right? We've heard, the lab problem. Some labs will test higher than other labs, and, they'll point to, well, we do it right, or we do it this way and it's correct. Yeah, I've heard, when you test different areas of the flower, and like different batches of the flower may test differently, right? So when you bring a certain area that might test higher. And some labs have gotten in trouble for, overstating. Like in Washington State, I remember years ago, there was a lab that everyone started going to because they would just publish higher numbers via their testing or whatever, but they got penalized by Washington State. But it seems like that's what Organigram is pointing to, that this is actually not a real thing, that people are misleading the consumer.
Yeah, I think we've seen this in market after market, and it is something that has frustrated me immensely over the years because A, I think the consumer deserves to know exactly what they're consuming, and B, I think it's not really fair to the cultivators who want to play on an even field to have to shop, quote unquote, shop it around to different labs to see where they can get the best potency rating. And then I think it's not fair to the labs who are trying to actually run a good business where they're trying to test the product well for, again, coming back full circle to my focus, which is the end consumer. And so it is one of those things. We saw it in Washington State, especially because of the separation on the vertical. Like you can't cultivate and have retail. So it is incredibly competitive on the cultivation side there. And then the retailers hold a lot of the power and they can say, we're not taking anything below this on the shelves. And so then you have a serious lab shopping thing. And I know, for example, like Steep Hill tried to establish labs up there. They shut it down because they felt like the landscape was not a fair competitive environment because they weren't willing to compromise their integrity on that. And I think that's really important. The other piece to this, which is super disappointing if you think about it on the long tail, is that all of the information of the product that gets tested through is information that we can actually use to extrapolate to understand better how people are consuming it, what they're using it for, and maybe as we kind of advance down the longer tail of pharma with this, you could understand better about the cannabinoid profiles and the potency of the product that really do work for different things. But because this has kind of been interfered with because of this potency shopping thing, it creates a bad data set. And you know what that's about, Cy.
Somewhat, I suppose.
The importance of a good data set is the opposite
it is.
to that.
It is. Kind of doing some research around this subject. I was looking at alcohol and the ABV, alcohol by volume, or proof. And proof isn't used much anymore. But I mean, at least outside of the US, but the ABV and consumption and just metrics around that. And even that's hard to get good data on because, I think, they look at a way of bracketing the different types of alcohol, like beer. You can have like one glass of beer, these serving size recommendations. And I think in Canada recently, I remember reading a headline, there's like one drink a week or something. And a lot of Canadians are like, what are you talking about? It's never going to happen. But one drink might be one beer, one glass of wine, whatever ounces, pretty small glass of wine, 1.5 ounces of spirits, right? So, tequila or rum or whatever. But they do that to kind of match up the volume of liquid to the alcohol content, right? So if you have 1.5 ounces of spirits, it's, roughly, equivalent to, 5% beer or whatever they're tracking. But the thing is, they've had ABV inflation a bit too, especially around categories like beer, where you have craft beer, these like double IPAs and everything that are, ratcheting up, and they do drive, a fair amount of sales, as far as I understand it, and there's also on the other side, like the lower potency or lower ABV IPAs as well. But
oh yeah,
I do think that drives up some of those numbers and some of those metrics, and it's really hard to know, to your point about, consumption patterns and understanding like cannabinoids and THC, right? I think even like alcohol with their ABV, they struggle to stay on top of it. And maybe they do that intentionally. It's a pretty robust industry over there. But before we get more into the consumer profile, I want to talk a bit about
its best time. Let's be honest.
That's true. No, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, being here in San Francisco, watching the last days of Anchor Steam as it winds down. I mean,
pretty sad.
Arguably one of the oldest in the country, and going bye-bye. Although I hear it might be saved by folks with some cash. But yeah, I think your point is a really good point, and I think you saw the proliferation of as IPA grew as a category, as a subcategory of craft. You saw these really boozy beers coming out, which again, it's efficient if you're looking to
Right.
get to the next level very quickly, but it's very quickly tricky. And the same thing sitting here in San Francisco and looking north at wine country. I remember when I first started going to wine country, I went to Napa because Napa had, like, frankly, kind of more of a headline to it. It was kind of that's really where California wine country got put on the map with the history of Cabernet. But one of the things that I remember from my original experiences tasting up there is they would kind of boast about the alcohol content in the Cabernet Sauvignon, and it was like, this is a 15% cab. And one of the things when I started kind of studying that as an analog to cannabis potency is that there is actually concern and scrutiny around what is on the label versus what's in it. And in a lot of those instances, it's because there is an actual cap in the state and in the counties
Mm.
on the potency, but then a lot of the bottles drift up to 1.5% higher. So if you have a 15% cab, that's very strong, by the way, for anyone who's not familiar with alcohol potency. If it's drifting up to closer to 17% that's a very strong bottle of wine. And, wine country is very cognizant of this for a few reasons. One, a lot of people, it's again like an interesting analog to cannabis. Like, this is an entree point to people around wine. And so it's an opportunity to educate and inform, but there's maybe a lot of people visiting who don't drink a lot of wine, and they could get surprisingly intoxicated from that. The other thing is that a lot of, I mean, you hire cars a lot to do this, but then there's a lot of people who drive. And I think being surprised drunk is not an ideal situation if you are out in a country road somewhere trying to navigate. So there are these analogs, and but again, like, I feel like the consumer landscape does shift. Like, just this weekend, I was up in Napa at this newer winery. It was called Ashes and Diamonds. Really cool. It looks like Palm Springs, but their pitch is actually that their wines are lower alcohol content, so you can try more of them and have more throughout the day, and you're not going to be kind of like knocked down right away. So they're hovering around 11 to 12%. So I feel like, though, that's a huge evolution over a long period of time in the wine industry here in the US. So these things move. I mean, and it does have to do with how engaged and informed the consumer is, and then how willing to try new things they are as in a category around discovery.
Right, right. And on the alcohol parallel, when I think about like the double IPA and like the higher potency or the higher, a Napa wine, which is maybe very expensive now, but back when they were just starting up, you get higher potency. But price wise, I think about like the cannabis products. When we're talking about 28 gram, we're talking about bulk. If we think about equivalized pricing, which is like the price per gram of THC or price per milligram for things like edibles, you get a really low price per gram or really low price per milligram when you're looking at higher potency products and higher package sizes, and that's certainly reflected in some of these things like drinks, right? And purchase behaviors. Like if you head over to the Headset website, we publish bestseller lists, right? So you can see like beverages, and it's just a small example, right? We have the whole list, but you can see the top 10, for free on the site. And if you look at the price, and it's pre-tax, post discount pricing, right? On average, just looking at California for drinks, the top selling is a brand St. Ides, which is about $6, and it's 100 milligrams. Like that is a deal, right? And it, like Uncle Arnie's and some of these like iced teas that are also kind of these small package sizes, like low volume of liquid, kind of like the 5-hour energy bottle. Those do really well when they're priced low, and that's a little different than alcohol. I feel like you're not buying a double IPA maybe because you're getting more alcohol for the price. I feel like it's still pretty expensive because the ingredients that go into it's just like more sugars, right? So they have to extract more. So it means more grains, and that's all expensive, right? And there's just a cost that's kind of linear. where I feel like with THC extraction, maybe there's a little more nuance there, particularly for things like beverages and edibles, where people are really shopping for bang for their buck. And that exists in alcohol too, right? There's like malt liquor, which is like cheaper liquor that has a bit of a higher potency. That world does exist for sure, but it's not as, doesn't feel as much of like the core profile of the alcohol drinker, right? Like maybe not,
No,
maybe when I was in college, I suppose. But
that
now
you
I'm
look,
not, yeah, right. Getting
when your wallet's smaller,
old
your share of
English,
wallet is, yeah.
right.
OE,
Oh,
crazy
yeah.
horse. Oh my God. It was $2. It was a very good value. For
Yeah, right. Which is,
definitely trying
kind of to the consumer profile. When you look at, Gen Z, we always talk about Gen Z's buying so much cannabis, right? They are like over indexed on cannabis, for their age group. And Gen Z also, when you search about like Gen Z and alcohol profiles, like everything is saying nobody drinks anymore. Gen Z is not interested in alcohol. They don't want to feel bad. They don't want to, consume the calories or whatever, right? They just don't want to be drunk. I don't know what it is, but it's all like, Gen Z doesn't drink anymore. And they're looking for mocktails. They're looking for, the
Mhm.
0.0 alcohol. And I don't know if that's just a trendy thing, that people are chasing, or if that's like the reality, or it's moving that way. But then when you translate that to cannabis, it's like, well, they're buying concentrates more, than other categories, which is higher potency, right?
Yeah.
It's a different profile if you compare apples to apples as far as intoxication, right? It seems like they don't want to get intoxicated on the one side with alcohol, but with cannabis, they're like happy to have, high potency stuff and handle that. So I don't
Yeah,
know,
but
maybe the stuff around Gen Z not wanting to drink, maybe they're still buying OE and drinking it in the dorm rooms, but maybe they've moved past it too.
I don't think they are. I don't think they are as much. I mean, it's funny. I'm reading this book, Less Than Zero, which is an old book, but it's like,
Hold down.
yeah, but it's good. And it's like the depraved youth that we were when we were in our early 20s. It's like this generation they're keeping it pretty clean. I mean, when you think about intoxication, if we're gonna say, okay, cannabis, you do have an intoxicating quality to it, right? You get high. The downside impact of that is so different from alcohol. There's just so much feedback on that in so many ways, and the lingering effects the next day, as long as you don't go crazy and overdo it and you're still high the next day. I mean, there isn't really a hangover, and there isn't some of these other things, and it is by nature low calorie. I mean, even if you drink,
Right.
I mean, some of the drinks are not, they're more sugary, but a lot of the drinks are focused on being lower sugar. So they're trying to walk that line in terms of what Gen Z is interested in. And so I mean, I give them credit for focusing on optimizing the way that they're,
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
this. I don't know.
I think I read too that a lot of that is for sure like the hangover, the calories, but then just like
Yeah.
education on alcohol in a broader way, and
Yes.
like the damage that overconsumption can have on people, addiction, and just being exposed to that more. Not that you can't get addicted to anything, but
Hmm.
alcohol abuse is quite debilitating, right? And quite dangerous. And I think, they're a little more in tune with that too, right? Is one of
Yeah.
the narratives that I've read.
Yeah.
And yeah,
There's,
cannabis just doesn't seem to be on the same level, right? If you're versus drinking, handles of vodka or whatever. So,
no.
they're just, more sensitive to it.
Yeah, well, there's that, and then there's the social downside. There's more domestic violence associated with alcohol. There's more. I mean, let's face it. How many times have you been out late and then someone's sitting outside on the curb crying? Like just because they had too much white wine or something. I don't know. I don't. Maybe that's just like not me. By the way, that's never me. But
Yeah,
I
right.
feel like
It's
no
always me
way.
for some reason.
It's always you, Sai, crying on the curb,
It's
or
that damn
like
white wine.
it's that damn white wine. It gets those tears flowing. But I feel like nobody is like sitting outside crying on the curb after they had like a
Right.
nice dog walker or something. It
Right.
just doesn't
Right.
happen. It's so. I mean, there's Yeah. So the generation is definitely dialed in on the downside of alcohol. I mean, you know me, and there's no shade in the game. I'm a fan,
Yeah.
but within moderation, just like everything.
So, back to our category, in cannabis in general, I mean, it is very much like it's here to stay, right? This high
Yes.
potency is the reality. And I remember back when legalization first hit for adult use, and there was a lot of innovation around, low dose, 5 milligram, 2.5 milligram, which frankly I really like, right? I like
Yeah.
the lower potency stuff. And when I talk to people that aren't really core consumers, that'll be the feedback, like, oh, I can't have that much. I can only have a little bit. Yet when you look at the sales data, it doesn't do particularly well in comparison to the other high potency products. And in places like Canada, where they were limited to 10 milligram, package sizes for things like edibles. Edibles are very poor performers compared to the way that they sell in the U.S. And in the U.S., even some states where it's a lot more flexibility, but states like Oregon just recently upped their cap from 50 milligram to 100 milligram per package size, which is just more in line with the other adult use markets. And now, what used to be 86% of sales going to 50 milligram package size, now it's 78% going to 100 milligram package size. So it's like quickly taken over, right? There's no room for the 50. Like, people don't want 10 5 milligram gummies as much as they want, the 10 milligram gummies. And that goes back to that equivalized price and the price per milligram, and you're just getting a better deal. And it just seems to be what the consumer wants. And in Canada, where there are limitations, you have issues where people are, not issues, I guess, but situations where people are consuming oil as an alternative, right? Because oils have a higher limit, right? And so you'll just take these like tinctures. They're not really tinctures, but something similar to that, as you can imagine, and consuming that instead of a gummy, because you don't want to buy a package size of like 10 milligram gummy. So that's the reality here. And I think when Organigram was talking about THC inflation, and obviously this is going to impact everybody. And has been impacting everybody, particularly if these numbers are correct, where the last 10 months are seeing such significant changes in testing levels rising. They're reducing prices, is what they said, right? So they're trying to bring the prices down, cutting flower prices. So they're trying to get to that equivalized price, right? So maybe if it's not as potent, but at least the THC per dollar is more in line with what might be expected. They're trying to boost potency, even though they said it's unrealistic giving advanced cultivation techniques. They're saying they're trying to do it in a legitimate and transparent way, which is basically like, we're going to boost potency, but we're not going to go find a new testing lab. But I don't know how you can just kind of snap your fingers and do that. Seems like it's going to be a bit tough. Things like connoisseur pre-rolls and stuff might be a way to do it, but for just flower, where you're limited to the harvest, it's going to be a bit trickier. And then they do talk about innovation and product development. So they're launching new product SKUs. Hopefully they're looking at, more connoisseur pre-rolls, things like that can increase that potency. But they do say they're trying to appeal to a wide range of consumer preferences beyond just high THC products. Which is kind of like talking out of both sides, because they're like, look, our earnings are down because everyone wants these high THC products, and we're going to innovate into things beyond high THC products. It's like, where are you innovating? Who are you innovating for, right? But me, I mean, like, we're all for innovation, right? Like, I want to see more innovation. Just hopefully there's demand on the other side. And then finally, they point to advocacy. They say, they're going to work with Health Canada to really try and get the labs on some sort of standard. If I'm surprised they're not already. Or whatever they're complaining about, regulation, enforcement, all of that. Just because if there is any sort of abuse, if they are right, and there is, then sure, it should be a fair game that's being played. But I'm sure all the testing labs will say why what they do is legitimate too. So it's a hard problem, but that's how they're tackling it. Makes sense to me.
Well, I mean, Organigram benefited from an investment from British American Tobacco and BTV, or British, I can't remember what the acronym is, but, I think a lot of these tobacco companies that invest into cannabis are trying to broaden their mandate and maybe correct a little bit of their image issues that are lingering from tobacco, which is just harmful. And I think that they should be investing in figuring out how to communicate with a broader base of consumers who might be interested in a lower potency product, because I do think the tip of the spear is the consumer seeking the the calculus, as we've talked about, potency per dollar. And then as you brought in kind of the bell curve of consumers, which is hard work. And as an industry, as we all know, we're limited on our advertising reach. If you look at the broad, like, let's just take beverage because we were kind of talking there, but if you think about it in other form factors, it's the same thing. You go to a grocery store, there's when I used to do consulting for PepsiCo, there's a ton of discovery process that happens in the merchandising in the store itself. But an average consumer, maybe who's looking for a more low potency product, isn't just wandering into a dispensary and then having a discovery experience on the shelves of a dispensary in most cases. And so we have so many barriers to entry to broaden the market segments that have opportunities to try these lower potency products. I'd love to see if there are these kind of analog groups like Constellation that invested in the industry. Some of these other ones, they should invest in trying to figure out how to communicate to the consumers about what they do have available to them. And that's how we change things. And it is through continuing to offer these products, but you do have to just understand that you have to lead the consumer a little bit, and we'll get there. But until that time, we're probably going to be focusing and seeing the results from the tip of the spear, which is great and great loyal consumer base. But there's only one way we can do it, and it's to help to broaden the reach and the exposure.
Yeah, it's that, or it's creating some sort of new Inflation Reduction Act.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.